We're back with another review from the movie channel that doesn't even review movies anymore. And this time, I don't even know if I can call this a review. It's a worm that's been eating at my brain, not unlike the worm that was apparently in RFK's brain. It's something I've been thinking about as I reflect on the 2 series I've recently finished that take place in the Japans. The stories told in these feudal periods, utilizing the unique culture of Japan, have made me consider some base elements of narrative in a new light. Really, what this is my own musings about how we perceive characters and their actions, interpreting them as either good or bad, deciding whether or not these characters that we watch on our screens are people we want to root for and see rise above, or if they're people we despise that we're itching to see crash and burn. Beyond that simple dichotomy, what else determines where these characters fall on our scales of morality? Is it simply perspective? Are we forced to root for these characters because this is who the film chooses to follow? Say, for example, in FX's Shogun. What if we were following the council rather than Toranaga and his allies? Would that shift how we view the conflict that takes place over the course of the series? How much of our allegiance is simply a matter of proximity, and how much of it is truly earned and determined by the actions that the characters take? The language of film is a complex one, but I would argue everyone understands it on some level. To stick with my example of Shogun, I will again turn to Toranaga. Throughout much of the series, we follow John Blackthorne as he is taken under Toranaga's protection at the cost of his service and, to some degree, his freedom. Because of Toranaga's propensity to spare our main character and his opposition to the council and the Portuguese church that wishes Blackthorne to be dead, we assume Toranaga to be, at least somewhat, good. This idea is emphasized by the treatment Blackthorne receives from Toranaga. Even further, the simple premise of the plot works in his favor. He is an underdog against the various lords of Japan, one who proclaims he is trying to preserve the current throne and prevent any sort of bloodshed. The standard assumption to draw, and the assumption that the show constantly threatens and pushes to its very limits, is that Toranaga is the de facto force for good in Japan's geopolitical conflict. In reality, we are given evidence again and again throughout the show that Toranaga is likely no better than the lords he opposes. He is simply just another elite out for power, just taking a more subtle and nuanced path to it. Even in moments that can be seen as downright sinister in certain interpretations, we have this nagging feeling that surely this must be good somehow. Surely this must be right overall. In spite of everything, in spite of his words to his lost friends and family amounting to, "Thanks, you guys were great in buying me some time," we are inclined to side with Toranaga over the council. And we can contrast this with Yabashige. Here is a man who we meet, one of the first men we meet, who is in power. He immediately uses that power to subjugate and enter into conflict with our protagonist. Blackthorne and his men are held in Yabashige's village and tortured at his order. Yabashige is also shown to be cunning and conniving, vying for a rise in station and more power by whatever dastardly means are necessary. Yes, his actor is incredibly charismatic and good, but we as viewers are primed in almost every way to view Yabashige and his inner circle as antagonistic enemy forces. But truly, how antagonistic is he? His biggest goal is to expand his fief. This is essentially the exact same desire Toranaga has, but on a smaller scale. Oh, but you might argue Yabashige is more of a villain due to his betrayals and his deceit. The counter here is that Toranaga is doing the exact same thing. On top of that, Toranaga is doing it on a much larger scale, playing with many, many more lives in this deadly chess game that he is so far removed from the consequences of. In fact, Yabashige risks his life to save someone that he has no obligation to. Yes, he was essentially tricked into it by Blackthorne, but this is sort of putting the self at risk, and is much more than Toranaga does for the entirety of the series. And you might counter this with the actions Yabashige takes in Osaka that eventually lead to the death of one of his allies and his own demise. But this in itself is its own counter, as the entire plot is something that Toranaga assumed and hoped would occur since he knew Yabashige's own tendencies. Even in the final moments of the show, this is stated to us, with Yabashige himself calling Toranaga out on his manipulation. But Toranaga's lies and wanton disregard for lesser lives are still perceived as somehow more honorable and noble than what Yabashige has done. How? How can this be true when they are both culpable in some of the exact same actions, yet their responsibility for these actions is perceived differently? It's only true because of what we are shown. A few less scenes of Yabashige scheming and plotting betrayals, a few more scenes of Toranaga tacitly approving of the death of innocents so long as it furthers his goals, and their final scene together is viewed completely differently by us. No longer is a traitor being struck down by the noble lord who will bring unity and peace to Japan. Now it's something closer to Game of Thrones. One unfortunate player loses out to the other, and now must pay the ultimate price. If you're still struggling to buy into this, consider Blackthorn, the protagonist. Very many times throughout the series, he lies to the faces of the people he interacts with. He claims that he is simply a merchant or a sailor, not at all here on business to cause conflict or to subjugate. He tells them he is completely different from the Portuguese wolves in sheep's clothing that infest Japan. Anyone who has ever taken a history class knows that he's full of shit. Hell, even if you have never even heard of the British Empire somehow, you could deduce as much based on the cannons his ship was loaded with. Characters in the show itself call him out on this lie. He was absolutely a man out for blood in a distant land, a land with people who he had no reasonable quarrel with, people who would absolutely die that he likely wouldn't care about. At least, not when we first met him, he wouldn't. But still, in spite of all of this, he's our hero. He is who we latch onto and root for in this mess of a political conflict. Even when he himself admits to being a piece of shit, we tell ourselves, well, at least he's being honest. Because at many points, that is the best we can credit Blackthorn with, ignoring all the times that he wasn't honest. This is not to say that I dislike him or I think we should root against him, though. His arc and disillusionment with his place and purpose in the world is incredibly interesting to me. Seeing someone who once so fervently served their nation become detached and resentful of the massive conflicts that invariably take the tolls of individual lives is really compelling television. It's just, typically the John Blackthorn from the beginning of Shogun is someone we'd perceive as an antagonist under most other circumstances. We cling to him because of his unfamiliarity with Japan, his cunning, and how he is willing to oppose the seemingly inane cultural sticking points of the world that he finds himself in. Our interpretation of all this conflict in Shogun is a mere matter of the perspective we were brought into the world with. Now, if we consider Blue Eye Samurai, the opposite is true, at least at first. We come into the world following a character who has been downright ostracized, discriminated against, and hated by the entirety of the society that they are forced to live in. It is for something they cannot control, no less. This alone serves to quickly endear us to Mizu, but their actions and desired actions do much of the same. Shutting up a slaver in a noodle shop is cheerworthy, and their longer-term plans are intriguing to us as well. After we see the horrible life and upbringing they endured, it's easy for us to understand why Mizu would want to exact vengeance on the men who had a hand in creating this life for them. Or at least, at first it is. At first, we just see Mizu clown on some cocky dojo dwellers, not really debilitating them permanently or killing them outright, but still beating the piss out of them. And since this is in service of a larger goal, we're cool with it. Beyond that, it looked really cool as well. And I'd be lying if I said the rule of cool never influenced me. But with each episode, everything Mizu does becomes more and more murky, more and more questionable. Are we really rooting for them anymore? Sure, we root for Mizu against the assassins that are sent after them, especially when we see who one of these assassins was to them. And now we've graduated from maiming to killing, but it's fine, right? They were assassins. What about when Mizu agrees to assassinate an innocent girl, rather than even consider any sort of more complicated potential solutions? It was a mercy kill, right? So it was fine. It was what was needed, even though that very same girl wasn't so sure of ending her own life. And what about when Akemi was abandoned? What about when she was led to a fate that Mizu knew would be a life of torture for her? It was fine, we guess, because Akemi wasn't the mission. Because after slaughtering an entire gang, a few more soldiers was just a bridge too far, maybe. The army in the fort, though, they were fair game. They were in her way. They worked for Fowler, even though we saw that one of the soldiers willingly gave up and was cooperative, assisting her even. Who knows how many more might have done the same if they were given the chance. Not Mizu, but at this point we're so far down this road with Mizu, we're so invested in the eventual death of Abijah Fowler, we're so consumed by this need for vengeance, that this surrender is more of a laugh than a serious consideration. And this is not a slight against Mizu or the show or anything like that. Again, I love this show and I love Mizu. They were one of the most compelling, badass characters I've seen in recent memory. But my point is, we never really even consider if what Mizu's doing is too much until we're explicitly told by the character who is the designated sage and mentor of the show, Mizu's sword father, that it probably is. And from this conversation onward, our perception of Mizu shifts. subtly, but significantly. We are more endeared to them because we recognize them as more complete. Everything of Mizu is finally given to us in the same way everything of Mizu is finally given to their quest for revenge. Because within the story, revenge is the art in question. But to us, the story itself is the art. And without all of Mizu, this art is lacking. It was lacking in a way we didn't fully recognize as viewers up to this point, but now we can experience it fully in the season's final episode. Mizu's determination against Fowler, their unrelenting advance, is all the more jaw-dropping to us when we fully understand the passion behind it. This isn't just for the life Mizu was denied and the suffering they were born into, it's for those she cares about too. Akemi and Taigen and Ringo. There is now and always will be more skin in the game. Because as hard as Mizu can fight when they have nothing to lose, they can fight even harder when they have something to keep going for. Now contrast this with Lady Mariko, someone who sought revenge but didn't really have much worth fighting for in the world. Yes, we root for her, and yes, we are endeared to her, but it's not with the same fervor that we find ourselves attached to Mizu. Even though both characters had their lives upended by injustices, their families destroyed while they were helpless, our perception of them and their quests are entirely different. Mariko seems to seek her own death at times more than she does her own vengeance, but Mizu is the polar opposite, outright refusing to die until the work is finished. However, both of them are, in their own ways, relentless. They cut down countless others in their quests, they forsake the traditions and cultures of their world when it suits them, and they are, by every definition, ruthless murderers. In spite of this, though, we root for both of them. We want their paths of blood and guts to be carried out, at least on some level. Why? Why do we somehow root for these two different characters? Because of the perspective the show offers us. Because of how it lets us perceive their vengeances, it makes them a positive part of their characters. Even further, the worlds they occupy help us see this as a positive part of their characters. Relative to those around them, Mariko and Mizu are heroes. They are our tethers in a world that can be despicable and vile in ways completely beyond what either of those two enact. So when all is said and done and Mariko's actions have all but ensured the destruction of a lord's fief, we find that cathartic. We find this a net good, because in essence this is what she wanted and what we believed that lord deserved. Her sacrifice is a worthy one and a fitting narrative end, one she has earned. Mizu's case is similar. Sure, bodies are still dropping left and right, but now not only is this vengeance just, it's grown to be more than a simple personal vendetta. It has grown from a score to settle into a people to protect. We're cool with the bodies getting cut down again. One, because it's cool, and two, because it's for the relative good of the realm. So all this to say, film and television are fundamentally unbalanced mediums, and it's imperative that this be understood. Not only because it can inform how we experience the art presented to us, but also because it can enhance our own stories that we tell. In many ways, the stories we watch are just optical illusions, things presented to us via a forced perspective. Being able to manipulate this perspective, though, can create truly special experiences. It can amaze and stupefy an audience much like a magic act. Maybe if you're clever enough about what you show and what you don't, if your frame of reference is set out in the right way, you could even give people something they've never seen before. Maybe, for example, you give them a whodunit where you're actively rooting for the murderer and against the detective. One where you're asking yourself if cold-blooded murder should be morally acceptable in certain circumstances. Or perhaps, on a lighter note, you give people a completely comedic bereavement when a hilarious Rachel McAdams sympathizes with a man who died that was about to kill her. Or you find yourself cheering for the weirdest character in the film out of absolutely nowhere. Or even, on a larger, more serious scale, an entire audience is sympathizing with the guy who is preparing to carry out a genocide because he's conflicted about it. The point is, there's a million stories to tell, and there's a million ways to tell each of those stories. So make sure the way you tell yours is a good one, the best one that it can be. Until next time.